Hello and welcome to another B3 on-demand training. This is an introduction to a new template for B3 project teams to utilize. The front-end specification template is intended to provide a basis for project teams to modify and use as part of their specification manual for a project that's required to comply with the Minnesota B3 guidelines. The Minnesota Buildings, Benchmarks, and Beyond, or B3 guidelines for short, generally applies to construction projects that receive state funding or are voluntarily adhering to these standards to create better performing buildings and sites. The B3 standards set a number of different goals related to sustainability and resilience. Benchmarks and some of these guidelines are related to or affected by the means and methods that architects, engineers, and other design professionals specify the materials, procedures, performance, or operations of a particular part of a project. Therefore, to achieve the intent of the Minnesota B3 standards, it's important that we put some time into developing a complete and accurate set of specs that accompany our design documentation. There are a few guidelines that we will cover in greater depth during this shorter introduction, but it's important that project teams consider the B3 guidelines breadth as it applies to a lot of different areas of a project, including but not limited to the materials, waste, operations, performance of assemblies, and more. So we'll walk through the template document and show the various pieces that can be used. This template will hopefully help project teams when coordinating your specification manual with your drawing set and with the requirements found in the B3 guidelines. So let's get into it. The specification manual is really a vital part of conveying your design intent and making sure that the selected materials, assemblies, systems, and other aspects of your project are being understood both spatially and technically by a contractor or other trades involved in translating a design into a real building or into a landscape. The drawing set mostly represents these materials, assemblies, and systems spatially, but a well-coordinated set of drawings and details needs to be coordinated with a specification manual. So the drawings and details can represent a huge amount, but like any medium, there's certain limitations to the amount of information that can be represented in a drawing. So this is where the specification manual adds a ton of text-based information into the way that a project team accurately and completely portrays their design intent. Whereas the drawing set really provides dimensions and the overall coordination of items, the specifications manual is where the project information and the performance of those products, along with the way that they need to be installed, is specified and laid out. For the B3 guidelines, these specifications also need to carry important performance criteria for various materials and assemblies to assure the selected and installed materials and assemblies meet the requirements. It also needs to specify the chemical composition of certain materials or products that may be more restrictive than standard project specifications for a project that isn't complying with B3. There's also various other components and requirements that can't really be fully represented in the drawing set that get detailed out as part of the specification manual. So these two items, the drawing set and the specification manual, are really interconnected and are really important to coordinate because they're the way that the design team communicates the design intent to the contractor, who then interprets those drawings and the specifications together to bid and order products and eventually install them. So the specifications are kind of this vital intermediary between the contractor, the architect, and then how the products and drawings that are part of the construction documents result in submittals, ordered products, and then eventually the items that actually get installed into a building or a site. So that's the background of why we developed the front-end spec template. It's really to assist project teams in better coordinating their specs with the requirements of B3, because these can be complicated, and we wanted to try and highlight and outline a process for spec writers or for architects or engineers who are going through this process that want to know in general where the B3 guidelines apply to their spec. Hopefully this template makes it easier for architects and designers in the various disciplines that are part of the B3 process to relay the product's specific requirements of B3 to contractors, so there's not a lapse in the handoff of design information to the actual products that get ordered. So to get to the new front-end spec template, you're going to want to go to the B3 homepage, which is www.b3mn.org. And from there, you want to click on the Documents tab, which is in the red sub-menu bar that's highlighted in this slide. That link will bring you to the Download Documents section, which has a bunch of tools if you haven't looked through all the different documents and templates and resources that are here to help you. And if you haven't looked at those, I'd advise you take a look at all of them. But one of those documents that we're going to talk about today is the front-end specification template Word doc. So this is a docx file, so it's editable, and you can pull it in with your overall specifications manual and edit it on a project-by-project basis. So when you open up the docx file, the first page is a disclaimer and kind of an overview of what the front-end spec template is. The disclaimer basically is saying that this is a template to help design teams develop their own project specifications manual and shouldn't be used as is. The intent of this is for project teams to adapt this on a project-by-project basis. The paragraph under the disclaimer gets at the front-end specifications development and kind of gives an overview of why we developed this tool after having some requests from project teams trying to better coordinate and understand the specification implications that the B3 guidelines have on their projects. So section 018113 is a section that's specific to Minnesota B3 sustainable design requirements and lays out the project goals and the additional requirements that B3 projects need to make clear between the contractor and the project team right from the beginning. These project goals just basically level set the team so that there are clear expectations between everyone involved, and the requirements that are contained in various sections of the B3 are understood by all. Part 1.3 is looking at the different related specifications sections that may or may not need to be included on a project-by-project basis. So one of the first steps in developing an outline spec, as it's sometimes called in early DD phase or sometimes even as part of the pre-design, when you're trying to line up all the different specs sections that are going to be part of a project, is to just call the list so that you know which ones are going to apply. So depending on what type of construction system is used, what the building usage is, typology program, etc., you're going to want to call this list down, or in some cases add to this list to capture all the sections that are going to be included in the specification manual, which may have some connection to a B3 guideline or requirement. So this is kind of a very project-specific exercise to make sure that the sections are outlined and that the project team knows that they'll need to be developed as part of the process. It's something that needs to be incorporated into the drawing set, and then, as it applies to this document, it needs to be included as part of the specification manual. So this is a good place to start, but it needs to be edited in order to really match your project. The administrative requirements are really looking at how you have third-party verification and how that needs to be incorporated as part of the process. So if there's assemblies or parts of the work that don't meet the B3 requirements, the contractor knows that they're expected to correct those things that don't comply. Part 1.6 is kind of a general overview. For those that aren't familiar with the B3 standards, and there's a lot of project teams that are working on their first B3 project and are kind of getting up to speed with things. So there's a general overview of where to find the guidelines. There's a hyperlink in here, and then the current version of the guidelines. The way that the guidelines are broken up into performance management, site and water, energy and atmosphere, indoor environment quality, and materials and waste will kind of go into how this specification and the various other associated spec sections relate to the guidelines in the slides coming up. But this is a general kind of overview of what the B3 is and how it's broken up. Section 1.7 deals with submittals and how substitutions should be dealt with in the project process. Submittals are a vital way of back-checking the process and setup of the construction documents, the drawing set part of that, and how they relate to the spec manual. The fact that the design intent is mainly represented through construction documents and through the spec manual, and submittals are how a contractor is to basically send a record of what they've chosen in terms of the manufacturer, the supplier, the specific variation of materials that are being proposed, and get that back to the design team to make sure that there's nothing that's been lost in translation. And for those that have written specs, and this is kind of old hat, it's important to know here that the way that this spec front end has been set up is to allow you to have an easier time figuring out how the guidelines apply to specific sections, and to just kind of give you a template to work from. And we may be going into more detail that would be applicable to someone who hasn't written a ton of specs at this point, but we want to make sure that everyone is on the same page before going forward. Again, coming back to the idea that specs are really needing to be developed in close coordination with the drawing set, and that's how a design team conveys their design intent to the contractor. The contract documents, both the drawing set and the spec manual, are that key interface between the design team, contractor, the products that get selected, and what eventually gets installed. Part 2 is kind of the main section of the front-end spec template that's going to be useful for project teams when working on a B3 project. So when looking at different products, assemblies, systems, and anything that's specified in the spec manual, the template is trying to help connect those different systems to the relevant B3 guidelines that apply to it. So this should help project teams coordinate the specs with the acceptable products, manufacturers, performance requirements, so that when the contractor is bidding the project, they know the exact products or the exact performance qualifications of acceptable product substitutions that they can propose to be added to the project. We also detailed different guidelines and the relevant information contained in the language of the guidelines to show how various requirements across the program affect what materials are acceptable to spec. And so that gets into kind of some of the detail of different exact guideline requirements as they relate to certain products. Also important in part 2 is the exceptions within certain guidelines that obfuscate the need for certain products to comply with the guidelines. So all to say that part 2 is really it's the big section of this front end template that's going to be really useful for project teams. And like most things in this template, you got to kind of go through there and apply it on a project by project basis. So an example of this within Part 2 is Guideline I-1A, and this is referencing the California DPH standard method for interior materials that are located inside of the enclosure's least vapor permeable and continually air-sealed barrier system. Products that fall within this need to comply with the standard. And this is just one example of kind of the detail and nuance that the template gets into, but also kind of the breadth of coverage that B3 applies within any project. There's interior materials, exterior materials, there's systems, all sorts of things that fall under here. And the template should be a really good start. But again, this should be applied on a project-by-project basis. And it's also important to note here and on the next slide that there's certain aspects of the B3 guidelines relating to materials that are not required to comply or that have slightly different requirements or exceptions to them. And so I would encourage you to read through those so that you know kind of what's acceptable, what might be an exception, and how this might apply to your project. Now, as the B3 guidelines are fairly progressive in comparison to what some projects who aren't needing to follow the guidelines would be used to, there's certain exceptions that can be applied to materials. Like, for instance, if you can see the red arrow here, so product types with 2 or fewer compliant manufacturers available from the combination of all databases listed below at the point of product selection are exempt from this requirement. So it's really important to understand the guidelines, what they're asking for in terms of product performance, but also to know the exceptions to these rules so that if you come across a circumstance where you can't find at least 2 or 3 different manufacturers that make a product that meet the requirements, just know that there's an exception for those product types. We provide a number of different databases or resources in order to find compliant products that meet the requirements of the various sections. So a combination of these databases and resources could or should be used. It's also important to note that this is, a growing and changing area of green building at this point, and we'll try and keep the current list up to date. But if you find any additional ones that aren't included in this use, as you can see, we have reserved for future use in here, and please reach out to info@b3benchmarking.com if there's any that you'd like to see included in the list. If you look within specific guidelines, it's important to note that, for instance, in this case, I-1B for wet applied materials has certain restrictions for VOC limits, chemical content, and other types of ingredients that are commonly used in these products. In this case, paints, coatings, adhesives, sealants. And so the guidelines try and steer projects away from using known harmful chemicals, compounds, ingredients by implementing these sort of restrictions on which products are acceptable and should be included in the list of product manufacturers that are contained in a spec. For those that are fairly new to B3 as well, there is a small projects compliance pathway for projects that are under 20,000 gross square feet. And so you'll see a number of these items that have an asterisk before them, just noting that they don't apply to small projects. So if you have a project that's under 20,000 square feet, these sections do not likely apply to your project. If your project is above that threshold, then they would need to apply. Guideline M2A is related to the environmentally preferred materials calculator. So within that calculator, basically project teams need to prove that 55% of the total building materials used in the project meet one or more of the requirements of salvage, reused, recycled content, recyclable, bio-based, responsibly sourced, or regional. So this is again just one of those details connected to a requirement that project teams need to be sure that the products that they're speccing in the spec manual basically lead to compliance for M2A. So when you're developing your spec for those materials, product systems, assemblies, keep in mind M2A is a requirement under the B3 guidelines, and that may influence what materials you spec, where you're sourcing them from, etc. So for those of you that are very familiar with specs, you'll know that Part 3 is more about the execution of the work and not necessarily as much with the specified products and individual sections that need to be coordinated with the construction documents. So Part 3 in A is the miscellaneous section, and that's more about how the contractor is actually executing the work and what sort of conditions are acceptable on the job site. General practices are allowed before, during, or after construction. So it's more an operational section, but nevertheless still very important because there are various requirements within the B3 guidelines that apply to how construction procedures are carried out. So in keeping with that theme of operation and storage, kind of the auxiliary materials that are part of the construction, demo, etc. Section B, materials, is really dealing with those materials and the storage of project materials, just kind of general practices for the contractor. And this is fairly standard in a specification like this, but number 3 and number 4 are kind of critically important here in that the use of substances that have herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, pesticides are not allowed, except with the listed exceptions, number 3. And then number 4 is really important to note because substitutions really are not acceptable unless the substituted product meets the same performance criteria and all of the other requirements that are listed in any one of the other spec sections for that type of material. And dovetailing with that requirement about substitutions, substitutions generally come in the submittal phase. So this is an example section of 07-2100 thermal insulation that we included to see how the submittal requirements can be catered to ensure compliance with the B3 guidelines for various materials, products, assembly in the spec manual. So it's important to note here that the specification should include unique requirements for submittals that usually exceed those commonly used on project submittals for non-B3 projects. Some of the items from M2A's 55% environmentally preferred materials calculator that we talked about a couple slides ago are included in here. It's also important to obtain letters, certifications, or declarations as part of the submittal process. So there's a paper trail for the project team from the contractor, product manufacturer, ensuring the product actually meets the requirements. So this example section can be altered and used for other sections that require submittals. There may be slightly different ways that this plays out, but this example should be a good starting place to base the submittal requirements contained in really any section of a spec manual to ensure that the selected and installed products really do meet the guidelines. Lastly, we're just going to come back to why it all matters. The specifications are really a critical piece in translating everything that the design team has in the drawing set into real life, so that the contractor handoff, the bidding and sourcing of materials doesn't lose anything in translation. So we hope this front-end spec template gives project teams kind of a leg up in developing B3-Specific specification manuals, that it ties in well with the drawing set, facilitates a good handoff to the contractor if they're not already involved in the design phase, leads to products and materials that are compliant with the guidelines, and eventually that we have better buildings, sites, systems as part of this program. So that wraps it up, and if you have any questions, please follow up. Thanks. Again, you can find the spec on the B3 homepage, which is at www.b3mn.org under the download section. And if you have any questions or comments, please send an email to info@b3benchmarking.com. Thanks.